price of the Suez Canal blockage for global supply chains. My guest is Brian Alster. He is General Manager of Third-Party Risk and Compliance with Dun Bradstreet. Hello, Brian. Good to see you again.
How are you, Bob? Great to see you again.
And since we last spoke, there was a little problem in the Suez Canal, the matter of a ship getting stuck. Who ever thought that would have happened, right?
Yeah.
D&B did some research, though, on which regions and industries and products were most affected by the blockage in the Suez. Can you tell me a little bit about what it discovered?
Yeah. First and foremost, as if the pandemic wasn't enough, companies are having to react now to other significant types of events. I don't think any of us would have expected it to be this. So with the Suez Canal, this is another reminder of some of the challenges that companies have to face in making sure that they can mitigate risks in their supply chains. Mm-hmm. In terms of the most recent event in the Suez Canal, we saw a couple of things. First and foremost, I'd say there were two regions that were most impacted, the United States and then Western Europe. I'll start with Europe first. Within Europe, we saw the UK, Germany, Belgium, France, and others in Western Europe all impacted. What was unique is when you start to drill down into what the impact was in Europe. There's a little bit of differences between the Europe and US, which I can get into. But first and foremost in Europe, it was things like vehicles and their respective parts and accessories. We saw also things like electrical materials and then raw supplies like raw goods like copper and electrical equipment that make up other appliances and mechanical wear. And we also saw plastics. So what does that mean in the trickle-down effect? It means that you start to see things like automotive industry impacted. You're seeing retail impacted. You're also seeing construction and commercial machinery because of the electrical material that are impacted. So you're starting to see a trickle-down effect on certain industries.
Certainly that affects manufacturing supply chains in a big way.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
As well.
Especially in automotive that we talk about.
Yeah. And what did you also say? Now, okay, that was Europe. What about the United States?
Yeah, in the United States, we saw, I'll rattle off a few, but definitely we saw at the high end kitchen and bathroom linens. We saw more electrical material, construction material, subfloors, walls, ceilings, and the subcomponents that go into those materials. On a lesser extent, we did see vehicle parts and accessories. We also saw things like rubber and a little bit on the pharmaceutical materials as well. Mm-hmm. And so that has a similar impact down to department stores, automotive supply. You mentioned it, construction and manufacturing.
Yeah, and automotive companies are already suffering for lack of enough chips, which had nothing necessarily to do with this specific blockage, but it certainly exacerbated it. Sure, did it not?
Absolutely. They're continuing to be under pressure to find ways, which is difficult because the automotive industry has moved so much further to just in time and making sure that you optimize the supply chain to meet the demand. Mm-hmm. And in this current environment, they're almost having to reverse that and try and find ways to stock certain critical components, prevent having to slow down or shut down plants altogether.
Yeah. Did it also cause, as if the situation on the U.S. West Coast in terms of port congestion, especially in Southern California, as if that weren't bad enough, did this blockage of the Suez cause some ships to come back the other way and cross the Pacific, thereby even making worse the West Coast congestion or U.S. port congestion in order to avoid the Suez?
We've been monitoring the port congestion. We do see it on the West Coast in California. We've also seen some congestion on the East Coast here in South Carolina, North Carolina, in that area as well. So I don't know if it's a direct impact, but we are starting to see congestion elsewhere, measured in days. And I think that the challenge, I think we saw at the peak after the canal was freed, I think there were up to 355 ships that were waiting to get through. And when you look at the average number of ships that go through the canal at about 40 to 45 a day, it's going to take weeks to get through that. And that's the challenge that we have right now is everyone thinks the canal was freed and goods and services will start flowing through freely. That's not the case. There was still
Mm-hmm.
congestion, and we're still working through it.
And anyone who lives near a port can see those container ships off, out in the bay here in San Francisco, certainly, LA, Long Beach, also just waiting, dozens of them waiting to be offloaded. So
Absolutely.
we're not looking at an early solution to this problem by any means, are we?
No.
Has anyone come up with a reliable price tag as to what this particular incident is costing industry?
No, Dun Bradstreet hasn't begun to put a price tag on it. But what I do think what we've seen is uh, the biggest challenge here is how companies are trying to react to it to mitigate the impacts. We've been talking to a lot of customers, and right now in the near term, they haven't had to impact their production cycles, but it's only a matter of time now. And so companies are really scrambling to try and identify some of the key ways to mitigate in the short term while also building the infrastructure for longer term.
Yeah. Well, a lot of these companies were experiencing shortages throughout 2020 just because of the pandemic. I mean, it
Definitely
didn't,
in
didn't
certain
take a ship to
industries.
get stuck in the canal for them to have problems getting access to necessary materials. So they've had a year to think about this, and then another reminder, if that weren't enough, of the canal situation. So have companies been taking, I mean, you seem to be suggesting that they're kind of making sort of like preliminary moves in that direction. Have we seen any real action in terms of redirecting or redesigning supply chains, reshoring, nearshoring, manufacturing and production, anything, or does that just take a much longer time to take hold?
In certain industries and in certain companies that have more mature processes, you're absolutely seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also government intervention. You're starting to see governments around the world starting to talk about onshoring or nearshoring, especially of critical supplies and goods to help in emergencies such as EPP equipment and other things around the pandemic specifically. You're starting to see that. You're also seeing some companies that are that have the luxury of going to other suppliers that are more geographically diverse. You're seeing them proactively bringing those suppliers online. I think
Yeah.
the challenge here is for some companies, critical suppliers have historically been in Asia. And when you have that, you're starting to see that those companies have to react differently. They either need to contemplate identifying new suppliers, potentially manufacturing on their own, but there's not a near-term solution for some industries.
It's almost like you have to, if you're going to move manufacturing, you need to move an entire manufacturing ecosystem along with it, with
That's
all the
absolutely right.
suppliers that are proximate to the plant in order to do that. I'm wondering what the equivalent is. Like here in the United States, we talk about, okay, China's getting expensive, the trade war is causing a problem, congestion, all that kind of stuff. So we talked about nearshoring, if not reshoring back to the US, maybe Mexico, maybe Latin America. What's the equivalent for Europe? Where all these, so Northern Europe might be sourcing in Asia, would they turn to Eastern Europe? Where would they go in order to get closer to their manufacturing base, thereby mitigating the risk of sourcing from Asia?
Yeah, you mentioned the 2019 trade war. It seems like a distant memory because of how many
Yeah.
things have happened since then. But the trade wars was really the earliest salvo, at least here on the in the North America, to
Mm-hmm.
really start having those conversations. You've also seen challenges with in Australia and in Western Europe. I think the challenge there is you're going to have to look to Latin America, South America, and then you're going to be looking at Eastern Europe as well. And
Mm-hmm.
there's been long success stories of being able to go into the different Americas as well as into Eastern Europe to pick up some supplies and certain manufacturing. I think the challenge has always been how you overcome the costs, the lower costs associated with most parts of Asia. And I think that with rising costs, you are seeing that companies are more willing now to pay a little bit more to ensure that they don't have disruptions to the supply chain. I think that look, procurement and supply chain has always been a cost center. Because it's a necessary part of doing business. I think what you're seeing now is the best companies are turning your supply chain organizations into revenue generators, because you're now measuring supply chain outages or the downtime in terms of dollars lost. And so as supply chain organizations and logistics organizations are becoming more nimble and more agile, they're actually helping the bottom line. And so you're seeing this change in philosophy where companies are willing to take on certain inventories that they wouldn't before. They're looking to diversify their supply chains faster than they've ever done before, at a higher cost, because they realize that this is a new cost of doing business, and the costs far outweigh the risks and the uncertainty that comes with disruptions.
Yeah, the higher costs up front, but certainly avoiding those tremendous costs that come down the line. Does that mean then that they are making permanent, as you mentioned earlier, some move, if not a rejection of just-in-time inventory policies, a moderation of it whatsoever, to a certain extent, thereby more inventory on your books, more costs with, as you say, with manufacturing in different parts of the world? Are they baking in some permanent new costs of the supply chain that are indeed going to have to be passed down to the consumer at some point, just in order to avoid those down the line worse costs if they didn't do it?
It's a great question. I think it's a little too early to say if the tide has completely changed, but you're definitely seeing companies moving to this, at least in the near term, to overcome this barrage of events. I think that it'll be a really nice story as it unfolds to see how companies balance that the two dichotomies between just in time and over inventorying to ensure that you can weather a theoretical storm.
Yeah.
And so I think the challenge is now is, I don't know if there's a right answer right now, but I do think that companies are skewing more towards more flexible supply chains, more taking on more inventory in the short term, especially for critical components and parts where they've realized the significant impact. And I think that's one of the big lessons learned is companies have to have a better understanding of who their most critical suppliers and critical components are, so that they can really overcome single points of failure. And we saw that time and time again over the course of the last year, that single points of failure have really brought supply chains to a halt.
Yeah, well, even before the pandemic, it was happening, but maybe it took all these other things to the lesson to truly be learned. I guess they can't be complacent anymore, not with a pandemic, not with a trade war, not with port congestion, not with a ship getting stuck in a canal.
And hurricane and tornado season right around the corner.
Let us not forget hurricane or tornado season. Okay, well, that's actually some positive perspective on these global supply chains, is that maybe these companies are finally learning their lesson and they'll take some steps to mitigate risk going forward. Brian Alster, always great to speak with you about D&B's research and insights into what's going on in the world. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Bob. Great talking to you.
Thanks.